I'm Ria. I'm a researcher at Stanford. I work with Stefano Erman and Dan Jarofsky. I think a lot about generative models and concepts in machine learning models, but I'm not going to talk about any of that today. Instead of sharing some technical work that I've done with you, I'm going to share just thinking through the work that we're all doing and sort of the impact that it has. It'll be a very casual, fun talk. So. I think that a lot of us are or should be interested in this question of, is this ML model doing good? Right? Many of our papers ultimately suggest an algorithm that implicate some ML model that we're putting out into the world. And when we take a breath and look up, if we care about society, if we're spending most of our time or most of our social impact on society is based on this like ML thing that we're doing with a large portion of our lives, we should care a lot about this question. But I'm going to argue in this talk that this question is just a little bit off. I'm going to argue that this isn't quite the right question, that instead we should shift from talking about good to talking about power, and I'm going to see how far that gets us. So, starting with this question of, is this ML model doing good, has at least two problems. The first is that good is this very vacuous term. I think a lot of people have talked about this. Ben Green wrote a great paper about whether good is good or not good enough, which is at the AI for Good workshop this year. But basically, myself and Rafa can have two opposing notions of what good are and write two papers on it and say both of them are good, right? So it's pretty vacuous. It doesn't get us very far. The second problem is that many of us are actually not working with one specific context, with one specific set of users, right? Rather, we are working not just in one context, but in many contexts. And in fact, many of us are writing papers that are supposed to span many different domains, right? So this almost becomes an impossible question. How could I possibly evaluate the paper that I've written and tell you whether or not the ML model is actually going to do good in the world? Some of us, I think, when we realize the impossibility of this question, just put our heads back down and go back to building more models because it feels so hard, like we might as well just not think about it. And that seems like really a disservice both to our field, to ourselves, and I think it also leads to a lot of people who are really socially inclined to just leave the field or leave the core parts of the field. And I think this question is actually not that impossible if we look at all the people who are studying it, right? So there's this entire field of science and technology studies, or science, technology, and society, STS, that has spent a long time looking at the moral character and the implications that go from technology and society and vice versa. And we should be looking to them, right? When we think this question is impossible, we should go like, okay, well, we're researchers, we're scientists, we should look into the research, we should see, oh, tons of people have written about this. And in fact, one of the most classical, probably one of the most cited STS papers is this classical paper by Langdon Winner called Do Artifacts Have Politics? And in this paper, Langdon Winner argues, well, it may at first seem ludicrous to talk about what the virtues or evils of steel or transistors, or in our case, code. We might feel that's like at first ludicrous, but ultimately he concludes that technologies actually do have politics. They actually do have moral character, both when they're used with a specific context, but even when they're abstracted away from all context and we're just talking about them like we are for most of NeurIPS, right? We're just talking about this abstract technology. And the way he says that we get towards understanding the moral implications of our technologies are not to ask, is this ML model doing good, but asking a question that's a little bit more similar to how is this ML model shifting power? In his paper, he brings up many examples, two of which are the difference between solar energy and nuclear energy. So he points out that we might at first think, these two things are sort of similar, maybe they have similar moral qualities. And he actually realizes that for him, the answer is no, this is not true. Solar energy is fundamentally accessible, comprehensible, and controllable, which means that it allows myself and all the people in this room to build it. It allows us to develop horizontal power or solidarity. In contrast, he suggests that nuclear energy has none of these qualities, and so what it is most compatible with is a hierarchical state, right? Because I, Ria, cannot own a nuclear plant, so I require a hierarchical state, I require a hierarchical plant, I require frequently a surveillance state, because plutonium used in nuclear energy is sort of so unsafe that practically, of course, there should be a surveillance state if we have nuclear reactors. And so this incentivizes vertical power. And so taking this example as sort of practice for us, we should now be able to kind of bring a similar framework to machine learning and ask, how are emerging machine learning models shifting power? Well, let's take a look. So I think this is like a pretty typical schema of a machine learning model, right? So we have a model at the center, we have a data set and a set of expertise that can be combined together with compute to build the model. And this allows some future person to put in an input X and get an output Y. These things all have like variables associated with them, right? If I had just put the variables, most people in this room still would have known what all 4 of these things are. And that should actually start to get us a little suspicious, right? Anytime we're abstracting things out so much, they literally take a 1-letter variable form, they're probably abstracting away a lot of important information, right? And in fact, I think each of these variables specifically abstracts out a human being. So in fact, the data set is coming from a data source, the expertise, all the setting of hyperparameters and knowledge about the model is coming from an expert, the input is coming from an input source, and often the Y, this output, is being handed to a decision maker who gets to make some decision with this knowledge. And I want us to ask, for each of these 4 people, how might we shift power to them? Right? We're going to I'm going to list a bunch of ways we could shift power to them and sort of think through which of these are actually happening. And in particular, I'm going to bring up 4 big dimensions of power. The first is knowledge. I think maybe as a research community, we're particularly inclined to believe this without convincing, but knowledge is power. This is sort of a trite saying, but also knowledge allows you to causally intervene in the world. You know where to intervene. If power is the ability to influence the unfolding of events, then knowledge certainly is an important component of power. So where could we shift knowledge? Well, it seems like there's several places, right? So we could certainly create expert knowledge. That's pretty self-explanatory. Many of the papers on NeurIPS are going to be talking about how we better understand the parameters that we're using, the hyperparameters, the optimization mechanisms, right? A second thing we could do is increase the accuracy of the knowledge, right? The output we're producing, that is a form of knowledge. That's the whole purpose of the model, is to produce this knowledge. And the third is that we could actually create general knowledge. We could create transparency, counterfactuals, audits, this broad category of interpretability. So it seems like there's and general knowledge would shift power not just to the expert, but to all of the people in this diagram. Okay. Second dimension of power we could think about is the actual mechanism of control. Do you have any button or lever that you can press that would change this process, right? Change the system that you're interacting with. Again, it seems like there's lots of ways we could shift power to different people. A typical thing is to have lots of hyperparameters. These are seem very lever-y, right? But we could also have these general mechanisms of influence. We could create levers that allow various people to give direct feedback to the model about whether or not it's doing a good job. We could allow, at this point, we could allow a user to literally reach into the model and turn off a neuron that they like or dislike the logic of. And if we don't quite feel like that's appropriate, we can at least allow them to vote on whether or not they should be able to turn off the neuron, right? These are all ways that we could create very general mechanisms of influencing the model's behavior, right? That anyone could do without expert knowledge. The next component of power that I want to think about, or I guess the next 2, are agency and this notion of boundedness. So even before I start interacting with this model, there is some notion that if I have power, I have the agency to choose exactly how I'm interacting with this model. I can, at the very basic level, I can consent or dissent. At a much richer level, I can decide, I want to give very rich inputs to this model. I want to specify that even though this is my application to this model, these are the reasons that this application should be sort of amended, or these are some comments that I have. Or I could want to put less information to this model, right? These are all parts of agency. You could also have this notion of boundedness. So I think boundedness here is this idea that whereas in traditional technologies, things like solar panels and nuclear power, once I opt in to using a solar panel, there's not much you can do other than create the solar panel. In an information economy, and in information technologies, this is not the case. I can opt into the information technology, I can opt into being evaluated by this model, and then you can use that information for many, many things down the road, right? So we have this kind of new notion or this new component of power, which is boundedness. And I think the interesting thing here to note is that agency and boundedness are not concerns for the expert or the decision maker in many cases. But I would put them both as important concerns of the data source and the input source. So the data source, agency and consent maybe feel more self-explanatory. Boundedness, I think, is highly related to privacy, or for those of you who are familiar with like contextual integrity, right? This has gone by a lot of different terms, but the idea that the data source should be able to say, okay, once I put this information out, it's not going to be misused by someone down the road. Also the input source, which maybe think a little bit less about, but the privacy of the input source could, for example, include when I put information into the model, maybe the model should output something that's like actually already encrypted, so only I can see it, right? Like these are all like kind of more deeper notions of boundedness or privacy than we typically see. Okay, so the purpose of this exercise was to say we started with this hard, intractable question of, does an ML model do good? We started to get at this more tractable question of, does an ML model shift power in certain ways that we can notice, right? And we want to know now, I'm basically saying like, well, let's look at the field as a whole. Which of the ways I just listed are we shifting power? Who are we shifting power to? And I think if we look at this list, we will overwhelmingly say that this is where papers get written, right? There are exceptions. There are amazing people doing work in all of these areas, but by and large, the vast majority of machine learning papers get written to create expert knowledge, to create controllable or interpretable hyperparameters that experts can use, and often the reason they create all these things is to boost the accuracy of a decision maker that they care about. In addition to saying it's the vast majority of papers, I would say that it's actually considered core machine learning to work on these things. And the other side of this diagram is considered sort of like outside the purview of core machine learning. One thing that this is really demonstrative of is that, actually philosophers of science, STS scholars, feminist scholars would have told you that this was highly predictable. And what it's frequently called is the view from nowhere. Right? So many scholars have pointed out that when a bunch of people say, we're doing something neutral, we're not doing something for any specific person, we're just doing like the neutral version of our field. Anytime people say that, what they're claiming to do is have a view from nowhere. And since no one actually has a view from nowhere, they only have like the view of themselves and the people who influence them. When you claim to have a view from nowhere, what happens to you or your work or your field's work is that instead of having the view from nowhere, you support a view from power. So you support the people who have the most power already, right? So this is highly predictable, and this is sort of like a pretty compelling proof that this is what's happening. The first takeaway here, right, is that this is the area in which papers are being written. But I think that there's also a much more hopeful takeaway, which is that we were able to come up with this entire diagram of machine learning research that could happen that would shift power to any of these other people, right? So these are not just sort of like compelling like ideas socially, right, which I think is super important, but also as machine learning researchers, these problems are all mathematically interesting, they're convincing, they're complex, right? These seem like things that any of us could be working on when we like start working on a project next week after we go home from NeurIPS, right? I think that this sort of serves, I would argue, as a first draft of what a radical AI research agenda looks like. So I've outlined that this is what's happening now. This is what I think maybe a radical research agenda might start to look like. And I would add maybe one key component here that's still missing from this as a radical AI research agenda. And many of you may have already seen it, that I've pointed to a radical AI research agenda that shifts power to the people who currently don't have power. But another way of responding to this diagram is to say we need to do more work to put people who don't have power in this position of power, the position of decision maker, or perhaps the position of expert, right? And there's also tons of work that you can do there, right? So currently, you require a large amount of compute, data, and expertise to be able to create a machine learning model, which highly skews the demographics even of who's in each of these roles. By creating models that require less data, less compute, and less expertise, we can put more people into the decision maker role. And that's also a very deep shift to make. It's a shift that's been called for by many, many people across like many humanist and social science disciplines in really compelling ways. Some people have written about it as shifting from surveillance, right, where people at the top get to quantify the people at the bottom, to I think it's called like surveillance, right, like looking from the bottom up. I'm really like slightly misquoting that, but it's like I have the thumbs up from the STS people, great. And another thing it's been called is where, for those of you who are sort of familiar with the idea of the panopticon, right, the guard at the middle getting to look out at all the prisoners is like sort of this like quintessential way of governing society. And people have suggested instead, if you move to the anopticon, that you can create a society where the people in the society get to look back at the guards and keep them in check. And in fact, this is not a new idea. There are basically like two rich histories. And there's sort of like a book on like our trust in objectivity that says there are two histories of statistics. One that in which the elite use statistics to hold prescriptions for those who are not in power, and a second parallel history in which the people on the ground use statistics to hold truth to power. And I would argue that sort of we get to choose which of these histories machine learning is going to most amplify. Probably so far, it's been the one from the top down. And if we shift more people into this decision-making role, we can do something different. And there's lots of really cool examples of people already trying to do this. The last thing that I want to say is that, so actually, going back to this for 1 second, I think this diagram, I think what made it feel fruitful to me as I sort of like scribbled out this diagram and reshaped and talked to people about it was that it showed both some of the framework of machine learning and how we could shift just a little bit, right? But the diagram also like embodies some of the norms of machine learning, right? The idea that you have to have this many players, the idea that some people are left out of the diagram, for example, the people and like the earth as like parts of the compute process being filtered into this model. There are like lots of things that I still kept to like the sort of the standard machine learning model, and we can dream much, much further beyond that. And so I think some questions we need to be thinking about, even as we get really excited, if you're like me, about ideas like this, is one, I am not arguing that machine learning has the solution to all these social problems. I'm arguing that it is currently a bottleneck to people who are trying to create solutions to these problems, right? When we only create models for certain people, we are bottlenecking the people who are trying to create laws and trying to create education, right? There are these amazing people creating these discotheques, like disco technology, like discovering technology workshops, and people creating amazing laws that try to get people to be more connected to and discussing more and investigating more the machine learning models that are being used on them. But if the super educated person is now being evaluated by a model in which they have no transparency into the model, the laws and education aren't going to get very far. Like they're bottlenecked by us as a community. So I think like a big asterisk to put on this is to like reiterate again and again, like I'm not arguing that we have all the solutions. I'm arguing that we can be a piece of the all of the people, all of the systems that are working towards shifting power towards those who currently don't have it. So finally, going to this last slide, I think questions to keep asking ourselves as we're excited are first, are we creating reformist or non-reformist reforms? So for those of you who aren't familiar with this terminology, there's this idea that you can create a reformist reform. You can create something that increments the current state of things just a little bit, but kind of keeps the fundamental structure that things currently have the way they are, right? And Ben Green and I think other folks too have pointed out how this, and Ruha Benjamin has talked about this, the idea that this is actually very related to this local optimum problem, right? So if you're near a local optimum, a reformist reform is to make ML models a little bit better, so society is a little bit less problematic. But we can actually go much deeper than that and say, well, maybe we should be creating non-reformist reforms and make sure that we're actually getting closer to the global optimum at all, right? That we're not staying in this current local optimum where lots of people who don't have power are being really hurt by the systems at play. So I think we should keep checking that with ourselves. I hope, and I sort of am currently claiming that some of the solutions that I've or some of the ideas that I've advocated for here, instead of just making an ML model slightly better by creating transparency or methods of intervention, you actually allow people to challenge the model. You allow people to say, this model shouldn't be here. You allow people to tell the ML community or the legal community that an entirely different system should be at play, right? But you can go much further. And so I'm always open to this discussion of whether the things I've suggested in this talk, if even they are sort of too reformist, we have to keep pushing ourselves. I think one way to keep pushing ourselves is to ask this question: are we moving towards the AI futures we want, or are we, in other words, more poetic words, are we moving towards our AI dreams, right? Or are we moving towards our dreams of the future? And so that is, in this talk, because we're a technical audience, because we're talking so much about ML in this week, I started from the ML framework and tried to shift us towards thinking through power, thinking through alternative shifts of power that we could be making with ML. But you can alternatively start at the global optimum and think about what would that look like for you? Would that look like equity? Would it look like co-liberation? Would it look like agency? Lots and lots of people, including some really great queer scholars, including Os Keys and Sasha Costanza-Chalk and many others, have pointed out that for them, their dream, their global optimum, is a society that values agency and context and co-liberation and the series of values, and have really described in beautiful terms what that looks like. I really encourage all of us to keep thinking about those dreams and ask ourselves, is any of the work I'm doing, just any of it, getting any closer to that dream? Because if it's not, I think we can just do so much better. We can actually use the work that we're spending all of our time and hours and compute in to try to inch towards the world that we really want. So that's what I have for you today. I'd be happy to take questions. The question was essentially about how NeurIPS and other conferences like this have such a strong commercial presence from big tech companies. So it's not enough, right, to just think about creating ML models that are better. What about the entire structure that is creating all these influences that might make the ML we're building sort of not more power shifty or not more radical? So yeah, again, I don't have answers. I think some really convincing thoughts in this area are one, that the having power is not inherently bad, right? The fact, I have a lot of power as a Stanford researcher. I have a lot of power as someone who gets to be at NeurIPS, right? There are other ways that I don't have as much power, but having power is not inherently bad. And instead of sort of being shy to say we have that power, I think we can use that power, right? Anytime we notice ourselves being, right, being surrounded by money and resources, I think we want to try to leverage that as much as possible and towards more power shifty aims, if that's our vision of a more radical world. I think that said, I think it's really hard. I think it's stressful and challenging to push forth ideas. And so I think creating community, creating solidarity, creating anything like justice and joy in your own life. Ruha Benjamin has this great thing about how the way you get through a PhD is to know what your happy places are and just constantly have a practice of coming back to them, both as a person and collectively. I think there isn't one answer. I think it's really challenging, but I think all of these practices can help. Yeah.
Going back to this diagram, it seems as if there's a technical implication here, which is the role of cryptography and privacy, and different kinds of technical problems that we traditionally have not worked with directly. Am I extrapolating too much in this implication? Because it seems as if almost there's I mean, the fairness community suggests often specific social kinds of ways of we have to understand the social context under which we work, et cetera, et cetera. But there's also like a technical aspect here as well, and I'm kind of curious how important is these questions of privacy in this diagram versus like the social aspects of like, you know, like valuing the agency of these people in this diagram.
Yeah, so I guess there's two things here. So one is like you specifically pointed out like, oh, you know, isn't this really uplifting that we all need to know cryptography and privacy? And I think that there actually like privacy was like one of many things that I listed. Like I think, right, there's like lots of work on interpretability and transparency. There's lots of work on human in the loop, like feedback loops, right? So I think like if your question is just like, oh, is it specifically privacy? I think the answer is no. I think there's like tons of technical areas to work on. And in addition to that, I think like I also hear the point continuing to be uplifted, which I think is really important, that I don't think that these solutions are like more important than the social solutions. I think that they're just like a piece of the puzzle that allows us to create something better. Done.
Question in the front.
One more? Okay.
Hi, this was really awesome. And I wanted to ask a question that may be sort of self-centered because I'm coming from HCI and information science and STS, is that you've named a lot of great work that goes on about this in those spaces, but what I've seen often is that it breaks down between the bottleneck that you named. So how can we kind of do this translational work or even collaborate with people in the bottleneck if they don't believe or reach out to those communities as well?
Oh man, I think this is a huge question. I think, there's so many things we can do. I think one is like continuing to bring up the idea that all work has values, because I think that one of the easiest cop-outs is like, well, my work doesn't have values, so like why should I go out of my field to talk to someone who's trying to get me to think about values? I think like bringing that up again and again and having like practical talking points helps, right? I think even being able to point out like, well, you know, we value simplicity as a field and like that doesn't have like like things like that I think help. I think just being in the room with interdisciplinary people like is like a value, like Katie Shilton wrote about a bunch of value levers that allow people to have more values-based conversations, and just like being in the room with interdisciplinary people regularly helps. So if you can get your institution to just like fund lunches together, like that helps. Getting people to like just getting people to like use their own, like be on the receiving end of their technologies, right? Like if you create a data set where like all the NeurIPS people are the people that are being valued by ML models, like maybe you get people to care more. Like I think there's like a lot of techniques that people have written about, but I don't know the answer. Yeah. Thank you so much. The last thing that I really quick want to say before Rafa tells me I should really stop talking is that I would love you all to give me thoughts and feedback. Like this is just like some of my thoughts. I would really be interested to hear what should be on a radical AI research agenda in your mind. I talked a lot about dreaming. There's a zine called A People's Guide to AI. Page 71 has this amazing creative writing exercise to help you dream up more equitable and beautiful futures. If you do it and send me your responses, I would love to hear them. I would love to like put them in sort of a collection together if you feel consentful about that. There's also a Radical ML workspace that some of the Queer and I organize, some other people in this room are in with me, where we try to think about stuff like this. Feel free to email me. Name and email are up there. Thank you.